All right, hello, this is Dr. Jonathan Millard. I'm just going to work through this really excellent Somso model. Very detailed, looks very expensive. So what I want to do is just kind of break it down, talk about its different parts, all the anatomy, and at the end I'll have a little an annotated sort of slide. Okay, so if we strip away the background and everything, what we'll do is actually just start by looking at the bones. So let me grab my cursor. We'll start by looking at this. This is a cervical vertebra. So there's a few things that will clue me into the fact that this is a cervical vertebra. Remember the regions, the different cervical regions, the different regions of the spine will have different unique features to them. And the cervical vertebra, write this down. We'll have a few. One is a bifid spinous process. So I see that spinous process right here. So there's spinous process, and I see it's got two parts to it like that. So that tells me that I'm probably looking at a cervical vertebra. Another thing is a wide vertebral body. So a wide vertebral body. So I can see the vertebral body here is fairly wide, a lot wider than it is in the anterior-posterior dimension. Some other things that I could find unique to vertebral vertebra in the cervical region. One's uncinate processes. So the uncinate processes are actually these guys. I'm drawing on them here. So they're kind of curved. So if you were to look at a cervical vertebra like this, it would have kind of a curve to it like that. So those edges there, those are called uncinate processes. So unique to cervical vertebra. And last but not least, you'll see some holes in the transverse process. So we'll call them transverse foramina. So remember, a foramen is a hole, so more than one foramen is foramina. And I can see that those transverse foramen are actually filled by a vessel. So this big fat blood vessel runs through these transverse foramina. And I see here this is the vertebral artery. I'll label here VA. There's the vertebral artery. I can see it there running with its veins. So the veins running with it. So those are just vertebral veins running with the vertebral artery. And we'll see that inside of the transverse foramen, which again is a feature of cervical vertebra. Okay, so that's a pretty good, some clues that we're looking at the cervical vertebra. Other things that we can note here that aren't unique to cervical vertebra necessarily, but that I can see that are skeletal features. So aside from this vertebral arch I see hanging off the back, or aside from the vertebral body I see hanging off the back here is the vertebral arch. Some important features thereof are the lamina. So there's a lamina there on either side. So lamina often targets for therapeutics, right? They may do a laminectomy. So a laminectomy where they cut these to access the vertebral canal or decompress a structure in there which may be damaged. Other things I can see is I can see this blue surface. So I'll highlight this blue surface here. This blue surface is a facet. So this is actually the superior. We're looking down on the top of a cervical vertebra. So this is a superior articular facet. And the superior articular facet is typically a feature of the superior articular process, just like the inferior articular facet is a feature of the inferior articular process. And the difference really is just the facet, a feature of the process, is the actual contact surface. That's where you'll see the cartilage in the zygapophyseal joints, which are synovial joints. So this will be lined with hyaline cartilage. All right, so that's pretty good for the bones. Of course, other things that we're probably familiar with already is vertebral canal. So I know this area here, that's the vertebral canal. And in one single vertebra, it's called the vertebral foramen. But since we're looking at usually the canal, all the vertebrae lined together, we call it vertebral canal. Okay, so let's dive in, start from the inside and work our way out looking at the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is kind of shaped like, I've always kind of thought it's kind of shaped like the letter H, like this. And there's a back and a front, so dorsal and ventral, and that's kind of what we see on the inside. So in the back, we see a dorsal horn. So the dorsal horns are the part of the gray matter here that we see in the back, and we associate dorsal horns with sensory and ventral horns with motor. So ventral horns will be on the front side, and the ventral horns are the side of all those little multipolar efferent neurons, which are going to head out and do nervous system stuff. So I see dorsal horns and ventral horns. Remember, dorsal horns, sensory, ventral horns, motor. With the dorsal side of things, we'll see a root that comes out. Okay, a root that will come out. Inside of there will be a little DRG, dorsal root ganglion. So the DRG, dorsal root ganglion like that, is going to be a site of sensory cell bodies. So more on that in just a second. Of course, if there's a dorsal root, there's going to be a ventral root as well. So dorsal root and a ventral root. And switch colors. It's good there. All right, so, and I can see those here. So I'll grab the laser, and you can see coming out of the back here where the dorsal horn is there, I see the dorsal root. If I follow this out, it's a dorsal root labeled right there. I can see it's kind of thick. So the big thick part right there, I think that's number 19. That's it. That's the DRG. That's the dorsal root ganglion or spinal ganglion. I also see the ventral root right here. And remember that technically these little roots are comprised of rootlets, which will come together. It's a bit semantic. So there's the ventral rootlets coming together to make the ventral root. And the ventral root does not have a ganglion in it, but I see the ventral root buddying up to the dorsal root like this. And they're inside of this bit of meninges called the dural root sleeve. Okay, so there's a sleeve of dura mater that kind of will push them together. And I didn't draw that over here just for simplicity's sake. Okay, and then last but not least, after we have our dorsal root and ventral root, and they come together to make a spinal nerve. Okay, so a spinal nerve, I'll label it right there. That's the location of the spinal nerve. I know it is because that's where the dorsal and ventral root are coming together. And from that spinal nerve, I'll see another split. So there's a little tiny wimpy dorsal ramus. There's a dorsal ramus right there. And then a much larger, much more serious ventral ramus. So that's nice because the name scheme stays the same, right? Dorsal and ventral. So I can see the much larger ventral ramus here, labeled 20. So that's ventral ramus. And then if you look closely, I can see like right here and right here, it would be sneaking out of the backside like that. That's the dorsal ramus. So the dorsal ramus, again, is very small. It is, they are almost always mixed motor and sensory, with the exception of one in most people. But the dorsal ramus, a much smaller job than the ventral ramus, in that it only does intrinsic back muscles and some skin over the back, and maybe some innervation to the zygapophyseal joints. Okay, very cool. One other thing that we can see is right here. So this is the sympathetic chain. So the sympathetic chain actually has a relationship close by that ventral ramus. So if I erase this part on my drawing over here, and I draw the sympathetic chain, kind of looking at this in an axial kind of orientation, right? Then I see there's a couple of rami. Now this person only has, or this section only has one ramus, a communicating ramus, a gray ramus communicans, but because it's cervical. So I can see the gray ramus communicans, that's gray ramus communicans, I can see that right there. It's label number 23. So that gray ramus communicans will connect the ventral ramus, very proximal in the ventral ramus, to that sympathetic trunk. Sympathetic trunk. So there's our sympathetic trunk. So I can see it connecting there. This is an off-ramp for sympathetics. This is a sympathetic off-ramp. In my illustration, I've illustrated also the white ramus communicans. The white ramus communicans is an on-ramp for sympathetics, but I don't see that I don't see it because this is in the cervical region. This is above the level of the sympathetics in the spine, coming from the spinal cord, which are generally from T1 to L2. So I don't see that here. All right, so gray ramus communicans, all good. Again, off ramp for sympathetics. Great. All right. What else can we see? So aside from these structures in the spinal cord, what else can I see? I want to also notice the meninges. So I see some meninges around in here as well. So the first one I see, we'll work our way from inside out, immediately surrounding the central nervous system. When I say the central nervous system, I mean the whole thing. This is the brain and the spinal cord. I'll see the pia mater. So right here, I'm outlining it. This little, it's white. That is pia. So pia means tender mother. So pia mater right there is encircling the CNS and including the spinal cord. And just outside of that, right here, I see the arachnoid. So there's the arachnoid motor. So I see there's a little gap. There's a little bit of distance between the arachnoid motor and the pia motor, which is here. So arachnoid motor and then pia motor. And I can see that arachnoid motor is continuous all the way around. It goes into that dural root sleeve a little bit. So, and we can see that space. So that space right there, I'll draw a star in it in yellow. This is the subarachnoid space. So right there is subarachnoid space. And the subarachnoid space, recall, very important, is filled with CSF. So cerebrospinal fluid will be inside there. And in life, of course, it's under pressure, so it's inflated against the dura mater. So if that's true right there, and that's arachnoid mater, that makes this dura. Okay, so right here is the arachnoid, and again, in life, it's under pressure. The CSF is under pressure, so it inflates it against the dura. So right here is the dura. Okay, and there shouldn't be a space. This is an apposition, but so there shouldn't be much space in between the arachnoid and the dura. If there is, the space below the dura is called the subdural space, so right there where the arrow is. So the subdural space is a potential space. If you had some sort of subdural hematoma or bleed, something like this, then that would show up as developing in that space. So superficial to the dura, we have a pretty famous space. So superficial to the dura, outside the dura now, in the vertebral canal, I see the epidural space. So out here is the epidural space. We're all around here, epidural. And in the spine, the epidural space is filled with fat, as I can see here. The artist has illustrated this in the model. And also the internal vertebral venous plexus, or Batson's plexus. So I can see all these little veins. It's basically a barrel of veins. It runs up and down. If you see this in real life, it's like this is big barrel. All right, so Batson's plexus, or the internal vertebral venous plexus, inside of the epidural space, along with a bunch of fat. All right, I also see a couple of ligaments here, which is pretty cool. So I see a little slip here. It's kind of subtle on the model, but the model's very detailed. I really like this model. This is the ligamentum flavum. So ligamentum flavum here is running from lamina to lamina. So it's segmental. So you'll see a ligamentum flavum at every level, and this will help stabilize the spine. I also see the PLL, the posterior longitudinal ligament here. It's labeled number 6, PLL. And the posterior longitudinal ligament, along with the ligamentum flavum, will help limit spinal flexion, keep you from flexing your spine too far forward. All right, so great model. I think this is about all we can see here. So we covered our bases. Great. So thanks for helping out, or thanks for hanging out, and I hope that helped.